we've got these diagnostic categories: hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, dilated cardiomyopathy. But to me, we're trying to be too reductionist. For me, it's the narrative. We talk about this narrative diagnosis. When I'm writing my letters in the clinic, yes, I might say hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but it's a fuller description that, this 30-year-old man has left ventricular hypertrophy with an outflow tract gradient. This is probably familial HCM caused by a sarcomere. And it's about 3 or 4 lines to describe it. Or I can just say, he's got HCM. Which is the more useful? Which is the more accurate?
Welcome to Cardiomyopathy Conversations, the podcast where we talk to medical experts and patients about all things cardiomyopathy, brought to you by Cardiomyopathy UK, the UK's foremost charity for heart muscle disease. Don't forget, if you enjoy this episode, to hit the like and subscribe button so we can notify you of every new episode. If you want to find out more about cardiomyopathy, check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Cardiomyopathy UK, or take a look at our website at www.cardiomyopathy.org. Welcome everyone to the latest podcast episode, which is all about diagnosis. And I'm here again with Professor Elliott. Welcome to the podcast, Perry.
Thanks, Libby. Good to be here.
So we're going to talk about the journey to diagnosis, and then we're going to talk about the experience of diagnosis. Talk to us a little bit about the various paths that people come to your clinic and the journeys that they've been on to come to that diagnosis moment.
Yeah, I think people come to us various ways, but predominantly in 3 ways, I think. So we are referred people who have symptoms or there's a concern about their risk of dying suddenly and so on. So they're being sent to us as a tertiary centre for advice on management of risk and symptoms. That's probably about a third of patients. Another third are detected incidentally. So they've been to their GP with symptoms of breathlessness, or they've had some palpitations, or they've had some non-cardiac surgery and someone's heard a murmur. Then they have a series of investigations and then, they might have cardiomyopathy. The third group, which has probably got a little bit bigger over the years actually, is people who've got a family history. So we're being referred by either cardiologists or by a GP. This person's father's got hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, would you evaluate them to see if they've got the disease? So I think it's screening, it's incidental findings, and it's people who actually have significant symptoms that require intervention. I would say they're the 3 major routes into our service.
If you think about the people who have presented with sort of vague symptoms, because, sometimes the symptoms of cardiomyopathy can be quite vague, can't they? And people might have been on a slightly circuitous route before they get to you. What would you say is the most common misdiagnosis that turns out to be a cardiomyopathy in the end?
Yeah, it's quite hard, really. I think some of it's age dependent. So it may be if someone's 60s, 70s, are feeling a bit breathless, then both they and their doctor may ascribe that to, I'm just getting a little bit old now, slowing down a bit. But in comparison to their healthy peers, they're clearly different. But you can attribute things to getting older or other conditions. I've got a bit of asthma or I've got some diabetes. So misattribution, I think. In younger people, it often, unexplained syncope. Young people faint, don't they? Yes, but this person was walking along, they've hit the ground unconscious, there was no trigger to it, they don't have any prior history of fainting, and they happen to have a family history where their uncle died suddenly in their 40s.
Do you come across that much though? Because I think if somebody's having unexplained syncope, that's a fairly obvious indication, more so than, I'm feeling a bit breathless, or I might, have palpitations, or I'm tired all the time,
I'm not sure
or that kind of thing.
Syncope is very common. It's a very common symptom, particularly amongst teenagers. But it's a lot of the diagnosis of syncope is in the history. So vasovagal syncope, people at school, prolonged standing in assembly, in the playground, hot day, haven't eaten, that is so common. So common. And just to sort of play devil's advocate, if you're a general practitioner, the people coming to see you are going to be young people who are fainting, they're going to be people who've got asthma, they're going to be people who've got a lot of common conditions. And the challenge for them is how, in all that noise, do I select out that individual who, no, this one might have something more serious. And I think that's, understanding the family background, being attuned to different kinds of syncope, or breathlessness, which is not appropriate to the level of exertion that person is doing, or change, when there's been a change in the symptoms, sudden change.
So is like a vasovagal, is that a different kind of event to like a cardiac syncope? Is that different? Does it present differently?
Yeah, very much. Okay. There's usually sort of, there's a prodrome, so there's a warning, so people often, they know they're about to faint.
With a vasovagal?
With a vasovagal.
Okay.
So, I'm sure we've all had them a few times in our lives. You feel hot, you feel cold, you think, I'm going to faint here, you've got time to sit down.
Yeah.
That prodrome, and then you faint and you come to straight away. Whereas, I was literally walking along the road, and the next thing I knew, I was on the floor with someone sort of shaking me. That's a different kind of syncope. I know sometimes it means asking questions in different ways.
Yeah.
Two of the commonest symptoms around which I think there's enormous confusion is chest pain and palpitation. Yeah, so
because they mean different things to different people.
Completely.
Yeah.
So, if I'm in the clinic, I may ask the chest pain question two different ways. So, do you get chest pain on exertion? No, doc. Okay. Do you get any chest tightness when you go up the stairs? Oh, yeah, I get that.
The other thing about that is that I think if somebody's always lived with that, they don't think of it as a symptom because they don't know anything different. It's just like, well, I've always been like this, so I thought it was normal. I
think that's a common pitfall from the medical side in the clinic. So, are you limited? No, I'm fine. Okay, tell me the things that you avoid.
That's a great question.
Well, I don't go up hills.
Yeah.
Or I try not to go upstairs during the day, or to go upstairs after a heavy meal, because I know I'm going to struggle.
Yeah.
So what are the things you're avoiding? I don't play with the kids, because I know if I kick a ball around with the kids, I know next day I'm going to be completely prolax, no energy, etc. So it takes a little while, and asking about the same symptom but in different ways.
We've talked before about how cardiomyopathies often get caught up in the big world of heart failure, and they go no further. You often talk about having a cardiomyopathy mindset. What are the defining features that might indicate a cardiomyopathy to a non-specialist clinician? What do they need to look out for? What are those defining things that you go, that's a cardiomyopathy?
So the cardiomyopathy mindset it's just, for me, it's clinical methodology. It's starting from the scenario in which you find the patient, and that scenario includes their age, their sex, their family history, the reasons for presentation. Because all of that orients where you go in terms of your subsequent tests and questioning. It's about, doing ECGs and echoes, but it's about interpreting those with through a particular lens. So if you're suspecting a cardiomyopathy, you can look at the ECG and say, well, this is a bit thick, maybe the apex is involved here. Now I'll look at the echocardiogram in the light of what I've seen on the ECG. It's a more integrative approach, and it's also iterative. So you may come back when you've been through the history and you've looked at the ECG and you've looked at the echocardiogram and you've maybe looked at some blood tests, you'll come back again and sort of look at it again and say, well, is there a pattern here? Can I join the dots? I think sometimes people see that as hopelessly old-fashioned, because all you need to do is do an MRI or an echo, right? And you've made the diagnosis of cardiomyopathy. But it ain't. You've got to get simple.
But it isn't that simple. But also, as the patient, you've got to get to that point.
Yeah.
So you've got to have somebody who listens to what you're saying and thinks in a particular way to even send you to get an MRI or an echo.
Absolutely.
And I remember you saying when we spoke last, you were saying, sometimes the ECG, for example, can be normal doesn't mean there's not a clinical presentation.
Absolutely.
Almost by the time someone's got to you, they're okay, because they're going to experience that way of thinking. It's the getting to you or your equivalent is the tricky bit.
Yeah, you're opening up a huge Pandora's box here, Libby, because what is going wrong in that pathway? Why are people not getting to where they should be going, or why is it taking so long? And I don't think that's unique to cardiomyopathy. I mean, we see this all the time in so-called rare disease, where some diseases people have taken 10 years to get a diagnosis, or they've seen 20 different doctors before they get to that point. So what is it that's going wrong? And I, in a way, it's easy for me as being an ivory tower professor in a highly specialised unit, because I can sit here and talk about the ECG and the nuances of that. But actually, the patients have got to us by that stage. So the skill sets that we're trying to promote through this, this concept, the cardiomyopathy mindset, but it's just a mindset. Actually, I think it should apply right at the beginning and throughout the entire diagnostic pathway. It should be the GP, it should be the next specialist that sees, it should be the nurse that sees them. Different aspects of that way of thinking, but it's, we were saying earlier, for me it's that question, why? Why is this person blacked out? Why does this person have an abnormal ECG? Why is this person's heart thick on the echocardiogram? Why? It's like an annoying child saying, why? But unless you ask those questions, you miss diagnoses. You don't ask the right questions to achieve the final definitive diagnosis. And of course, I think we've said before, is that even when you say someone's got a cardiomyopathy, that's not the diagnosis. It's a description of what you're seeing when you're taking pictures of the heart, but it's not telling you the cause. And it's that why thing is taking it to the next stage, so that you can, if you can, to say what it's being caused by this particular gene mutation, or if you've got amyloid, or because whatever.
Do you find that diagnosis changes over time? Somebody might start off with a diagnosis of the Y for one type of cardiomyopathy, but then as time progresses, you might look at that person and think, actually, I think your diagnosis is changing. How do you explain that to people? Because I think once you've got a label, there's a certain amount of identification with the label, and then if that changes, that's quite a tricky conversation to have with someone, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I've probably underestimated that. I mean, and it's happened more in some cardiomyopathies than others. So, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, yes, we know more about the genes and so on, but the narrative hasn't changed that much in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. What can change is that the nature of the condition can evolve, so people can develop heart failure, their ventricle may start to fail in later life, they may develop atrial fibrillation and so on. So it evolves, the disease evolves. But we wouldn't come along and say, you know what, we don't think you've got hypertrophic cardiomyopathy now, you've got something else. That doesn't happen so often. Dilated cardiomyopathy and arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy, whatever we're going to call that, if I look back over a 10, 20-year period, that's changed enormously.
Okay.
So I think we've expanded the spectrum of disease. Genetics has had a profound effect on how we manage dilated cardiomyopathy. We have this non-dilated phenotype, which you really only diagnose if you do a cardiac MRI. The whole notion of arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy is still controversial. What really is that? How do you define it?
Do you ever see people that come to you with a diagnosis of something, for example, ARVC, and you say, actually, no, I don't think it is. I don't think it is that in my... in my wisdom, in your ivory tower professorial kind of way.
Rarely, I would say.
Okay.
Very rarely. I think what I might say is, look, this has been labelled as dilated cardiomyopathy, but there's another layer here. So I think you might have a genetic disease. If it turns out to be one of these 4 or 5 different genes, then that might put you at a higher risk of dying suddenly. So then we would have to think about defibrillators, irrespective of what your heart function is doing or how you've responded to medical therapy and your symptoms are better. So the description of how you're going to manage that person, yes, that definitely can change when they come to see us. Very rarely do I turn around and say, either, you've been told you don't have something, but I think you do, or vice versa.
I mean, how important is that genetic diagnosis?
Depends on the cardiomyopathy. I think there are some general benefits to a genetic diagnosis in that it gives you the diagnosis. So here's the explanation for why you have a cardiomyopathy. It provides an individual and their family with an assessment of who else in the family might be at risk. So it gives you the opportunity to identify other individuals. For me, it's the ultimate in prevention, because you say, look, you have the same variant as your parent, so you're the one we need to keep an eye on. Listen, you're fine, go away. You don't have anything wrong with you, and you're not going to develop a cardiomyopathy. So that's really quite important in terms of the family dynamics and also use of resources. It can have a profound effect. Increasingly, for example, in dilated cardiomyopathy, it has a profound effect on what we recommend with regard to defibrillator implantation. Of course, what has been science fiction, but which is starting to happen, is that maybe understanding the gene gives you a therapeutic target. So you might design a therapy, a small molecule or a gene therapy, which is going to enable you to be able to treat that person's underlying disease. So I think there's multiple facets of a genetic diagnosis which are helpful.
Do you think that all cardiomyopathies are genetic?
No.
We just don't know?
No. So I think there are different types of genetic inheritance. So normally we think about a single gene defect. So you've got a genetic mutation in this gene, you're going to get HCM or dilated cardiomyopathy. It's very clear that what we call polygenic inheritance is important. So just in the same way as some of us are predisposed to develop high blood pressure or to develop diabetes, because we've inherited not one, not 10, but maybe hundreds of variants that in aggregate make us at greater risk of developing a condition. And we know that from studies now in HCM and DCM, that if you've got a sort of an adverse genetic background, you may be more prone to developing left ventricular hypertrophy, for example. Should you become hypertensive, or should you be a bit overweight or develop sleep apnea, then you're more likely to develop hypertrophy. So I think the polygenic thing accounts for another big slice. We've got these diagnostic categories: hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, dilated cardiomyopathy. But we're trying to be too reductionist. For me, it's the narrative. We talk about this narrative diagnosis. When I'm writing my letters in the clinic, yes, I might say hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but it's a fuller description of that. This 30-year-old man has left ventricular hypertrophy with an outflow tract gradient. This is probably familial HCM caused by a sarcomere. And it's about 3 or 4 lines to describe it. Or I can just say, he's got HCM. Which is the more useful? Which is the more accurate?
Yes, but yet again, Perry, I feel like I need to say that is you.
I know, but it's not hard. And so all we can do is bang on about the same old message, and to show where doing that kind of stuff, spending a little bit of time to describe what you're seeing, to seek the etiology, has impact.
When we think about the diagnostic pathway, so people will often have had a diagnosis before they get to you. There's then what feels like an inordinate length of time before you get to see that person that will say, yes, it is. And in that time, quite a lot of things can happen to that person. For example, they might not be able to work until they've had confirmation. They will go away and do the famous Google moment. I think they're going to drop dead, for sure. How can we bridge that gap? Is it a case of working with general practice? Is it a case of using the ICC nurse team more? Is it a charity role?
So it's something that not just me, but all of us in inherited cardiac condition services are thinking about. In this country and every other country too. We've all had exponential growth in the populations of people that want to come and see us, but also the ones that we follow. And that model isn't sustainable anymore. And that's what's generating long waiting times, etc. Part of the reason why we've got long waiting times. So how do we fix that? Well, we need to, I think, honestly appraise our service models. Is it necessary for everybody with a diagnosed cardiomyopathy to come to a centre like ours? Is it necessary for them all, or a significant proportion of them, to remain under follow-up forever? Of course, the answers to both those questions can't be yes. We need to be cleverer and smarter about that. But if we're suggesting that you're going to have that people are going to have high quality care, not necessarily in the fancy tertiary centre, that to me implies you've got to have a network model for care. Yes, you have your tertiary centre where the difficult people come. They have second opinions, third opinions. They have myectomies, whatever it is. But that centre supports a network of other units in other hospitals that can provide different levels of care. And it's not necessary for any individual to go up every level, because it may be that everything could be managed in a DGH, for example. But I think the problem we have is that these conditions are not, that dreadful word, rare. There's a ton of people out there with dilated cardiomyopathy or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that need assessment, that need risk evaluation. Most of them probably don't need any drugs. Majority of them don't need a defibrillator, but they've got to have that assessment. I don't think we're going to be able to manage the workload until we move to that kind of approach.
Thinking about your process for giving a diagnosis, I know you said before it's quite structured. So people have come to you various routes, you've done all the tests, you come to the moment where, okay, I'm sure now this is your diagnosis. What are the things that you consider in sharing that diagnosis with someone? What are the things you need to cover?
So as you say, it is fairly structured, and I think that's based on rehearsal of this approach with people and trying to answer what are essentially the same questions. They're unique to the individual and their family, but most people have the same concerns. So I always start by, as a confirmatory opening, so you have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but just let me explain what that really means. Hypertrophic means thickened, cardiomyopathy means heart muscle problem. It sounds trite, but a lot of people struggle still with that. Cardiomyopathy sounds awful.
It does.
But just start there. How common is this? You're not alone. A lot of people feel they've got something really weird.
Yes.
And sometimes people have done, they've been to Cardiomyopathy UK or they've been to a patient meeting, so they realise actually there are a lot of other people like them. But a lot of people haven't had that experience. So just making it clear, actually there are hundreds, thousands of people like you, most of whom are okay.
Yeah.
So the starting point is actually for most people with your condition, we can't cure it, but we can manage most problems, and a lot of people don't actually have many problems over the course of their lifetime. So that's generally my starting point, because that's what am I doing now? I suppose I'm trying to deal with the Google moment thing, because if you put dilated cardiomyopathy or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the thing that they've seen is you're going to die in 2 years. They read about footballers dropping dead suddenly. You're going to have a heart transplant. And of course, for a small minority of people, that is what's going to happen. But for the vast majority, it's not.
Yeah. I think, that you say, what am I doing? What you're doing is you're orientating people to this new world that they have to navigate, and actually saying, it's not as scary as you might think it is.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, it's reassuring, but it's educating, but it's just orientating around the new norm.
Press the reset on what you may have been told or what you may have read before. That's always the starting point. Yeah,
and also, as we were just saying, the longer you wait between that moment of you've got this to see somebody like you, the more that
of course
grows.
Particularly if you've got symptoms as well, because
hugely,
because you've been living with those. Oh my God, what have I got?
And when your employer says to you, actually, don't come into work, right, until you know what it is, you're like, oh God, this is really bad.
Yeah, and that can have a financial knock-on as well.
Huge.
So that's the starting point, and then the sort of structure I then follow is say, okay, well, I talk about these boxes. So the first one is, do you have symptoms? So what we need to do, if you do, to understand them and work out how we're going to treat them.
Mm.
The second thing is, are you at risk? Are you at risk of dying suddenly? And I'll say the words dying suddenly.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the conversations that people have been oblique.
Yeah.
Or they've been smack in the face. You are at risk. Come back and see me again in 6 months' time. If you survive, that's that last line isn't said, but it's almost implicit sometimes in some of the consultations that take place. But it's to say, let's talk about dying suddenly. But it's also not just about that. There are other things we need to think about. So, what is your stroke risk? What is your
Yes. What sort of language do people use when? Because I know, and this has come up before. I know in conferences and things, the concept of dying, and people have all these words to avoid saying dying. I mean, even sudden cardiac death.
Yeah.
I mean, does that actually mean I'm going to die, or does it just mean that part of my heart's going to die? But actually, all of that. So, I think, using the word dying suddenly is really helpful. What sort of other words might people come across?
The commonest euphemism that people use is heart attack,
which is probably just plain wrong.
Well, it can mean different things to people. So I think often, this comes up all the time when we're taking family histories. Well, my dad had a heart attack at the age of 50. What do you mean by that? Mm-hmm. And it could be that they died suddenly, or it could be that they had a coronary occlusion, which is what medics mean by a heart attack, and they had a stent and so on. So it takes on a
totally different world,
totally different meaning then. But I think people, I'm often asked, am I at risk of having a heart attack? And so I have to unpack that. What do you understand by that? Again, I'm quite fortunate. By the time most people get to us, they're pretty genned up. So I think the sudden death, there's the sudden death word, but what hasn't happened is part of that structure. Let me talk you through whether I think you are at risk. And actually, before I get to the symptom thing, I often start with the risk thing.
Oh, do you? So you're open with that?
I'm open with that, because that's often the elephant in the room when someone comes in. So, okay, here I am, I've come to this centre, I'm seeing the big professor, I've got this condition which I've read all about, someone's told me it might kill me. What's he going to say? Yeah. So I often, because actually most of the time they're not at risk, so I start with that one. Yeah. So I say, yes, one box is symptoms, another box is risk, the other one is what's causing this, what are the implications for your family, are there any other tests we need to do? They're usually the three boxes. And I say, let's start with the risk. We've done all these tests, and you don't have a bad family history, your wall thickness isn't that bad. Yes, it's thicker than it should be, but it's not that bad. We've done the tape, there's no arrhythmias on the tape, I don't think you're at risk. Increasingly, we say, okay, if I can put some numbers on that, so then I'll get out my laptop and we'll go through the risk calculator, and I say, what does this mean in numbers for you? If I took 100 people like you, then one of those individuals over the next 5 years might be at risk of having a potentially life-threatening rhythm. How do you react to that? Does that sound like a high risk to you or a low risk?
See, I think the way that you say that is really interesting, because when you say, if I take X amount of people like you over the next 5 years, one person will, is different to saying you've got a 1% risk.
Chance. Some people think mathematically, so for them they have a concept of what 1% looks like, but most people don't.
No.
And the response to the 1 in 100, again, some people, that's a completely unacceptable risk. I'm not going to take a chance of 1 in 100. That's quite a rare reaction.
I was going to say, I think that's, 1 in 100 is really quite small.
See that? So this conversation can take quite a significant amount of time, because we talk through what that means. What are the comparative risks? What other things are going to give you, are associated with that level of risk? The response to risk depends on your own personal philosophy, your religion, whether you're married with kids, how old you are. If you're 16, you're immortal. 16-year-old risk, what does that mean for me? Whereas, if see him 10 years later or 20 years later and he's sort of now married, he's thinking of having kids, well, I want to be around for the kids. So the perception and the response to risk is very individual and quite fluid thing.
Do you ever explain to people what their risk is in relation to the sort of underlying risk in the general population?
Yeah.
Because that's another leveller, isn't it?
That becomes more and more important the older you get. And this is another thing which I try to teach younger doctors. It's because they'll come in and say, I've got 82-year-old lady next door, she doesn't want to have an ICD, but I think she's at risk. Okay, well, let's come in and sit down to it. And often it's, can you just leave me alone, dear?
Yeah.
Because for me, at my age, okay, it would be great to live a little bit longer, but actually I want to live well for as long as I can.
That's such an important thing, isn't it?
So that's what I meant by personal. I mean, equally, you 82-year-old might be a hang glider or whatever, and say, actually, I would like to hang around a bit longer, and if I think I'm at risk, then put it in.
Yeah.
So I don't think there are any. We talk about these percentage risks and what you should do. It's using that estimate. So it's the best guess we can make as to what your risk might be. Now let's talk about what that means for you. As I say, it's rare, I think, that I get someone coming in, banging the table saying, I really, really want a defibrillator. After a discussion, some will, some won't. It's quite, I think, I'm fooling myself, I think it's quite unusual for me to say, before that person leaves the room, I really, really think you should have a defib. I hope that I've transmitted my concern in the explanation of the risk. But
this is the tricky thing with patient choice, isn't
it? Well, it's not tricky. It's
only in as much as, I think, from the clinician's point of view, you advise, I think you should go down this path. But ultimately, it's the patient's choice.
Absolutely.
People can make what might be perceived to be bad decisions. That's their right.
But it's their decision.
They can do that.
Our job is to make sure they've been given all the information that they need to make their own personal decision. I think in some conditions it's important not just to focus on the sudden death thing. Because sometimes the risks, the one that is as important, sometimes more important, is AF and stroke. So I spend a lot of time trying to explain that one, because that's, if there I may say to someone, look, I think you need to be on an anticoagulant. That's quite a barrier. As big as having a defib? No, but being on a blood thinner, or do you mean warfarin, or am I at risk of bleeding? That a lot of people are quite anxious about going on anticoagulants.
Because also there are, there's measurements and there's monitoring and all of that stuff that comes with that. That's a real kind of impingement on your life. So again, you have to understand why you need it, why it's important, and then make a balanced decision.
Completely. That's all sitting in the risk box. Sometimes I'll talk about the exercise bit then.
I was going to come on to that, because I think that's one of those things where, and I think the word exercise is another thing that sort of, it's loaded and means different things to different people. So you might say exercise to one person, they'll think pumping iron down the gym. Somebody else might think, oh God, I'm running a marathon. So I think, the whole word exercise is loaded. The word activity is much, much better because it encompasses what people do as part of their everyday life. So it might not be, can I run a marathon or can I go to the gym? It might just be, can I carry the shopping from the car up some stairs? Can I lift my grandchildren, my children? Can I, how can I live my everyday life with this condition safely? And at what point do I have to say, no, I can't do that? Or at what point do I say, actually, I'm going to do, until I start to get some kind of manifestation of symptoms that will stop me. Do you see what I mean?
That's exactly the conversation I have. It's why I often leave that one till last, because most of the advice we give about exercise is mostly about the symptoms. I mean, there are certain conditions, certain circumstances where you have to be more prescriptive. Yeah. I mean, you know very well, we're less prescriptive about exercising people with cardiomyopathy than we used to be.
Even ARVC?
If it's genuine ARVC, plakophilin variant, then avoidance of competitive exertion, yes. You then walk into the data-free zone. So what do you mean by competitive? Does that mean going out for a run for 20 minutes? Does that mean kicking a football around? And of course, the actual answer is we don't know, because most of the data comes from people who've done intense exertion. So what I'm saying now is the narrative I have in the clinic. Because I think it's equally important not only to say the things that we think we're reasonably sure about, but actually to talk about where the gaps in evidence are. And to make it clear that some of this is, it's not really common sense, but it's about a general acceptance that we don't have all the answers. I have to live with this condition. So, what do we think in our conversation today is a reasonable way forwards? Because there is no zero risk way of living, whether you have a cardiomyopathy or not, right?
Absolutely.
And the majority of people with cardiomyopathy are at low risk. Bad stuff doesn't happen to the majority of them. So I think we have to manage these theoretical risks in a way which is sympathetic to someone actually living a normal, as near normal life as they can. I'm giving away too many secrets, maybe.
I'm up for secrets.
One of the worst things about having a genetic condition is guilt. If you're dealing with an adult, I may have got this from one of my parents. Am I really going to go home and tell my 83-year-old mother that she might be the person who's given this to me? I've got 3 kids. Okay. What do I do about that? Have I given it to them? Again, by the time people come to us, a lot of them have thought this through. Actually, increasingly, their kids may already been referred in for screening. So that we often don't have to initiate that. That's already been done. Although the pros and cons of screening maybe have not been entirely, because the medical imperative is screen, prevent. But screening is exactly like a genetic test, clinical screening. What happens if... When
you reveal the result.
And that's okay, but go into it with your eyes open, sort of thing. So that's the kind of conversation. So these are the people who may be at risk. What are the pros and cons of screening? We can take, and there are different approaches to that. People want to follow different approaches. One way of doing this is we could start with the gene test. So we do the genetic analysis. If we find something in you, then the other family members could then be screened. They could have the gene test first. If they don't have the gene, they forget about it. Those who do carry it, they then need to further evaluation. That's one strategy. Another is to say, well, just start the clinical screening. Trying to help, and I don't think we do this bit very well, but families are complex things. So communication within a family. So you've got 10 siblings. You haven't spoken to half of them for 20 years. Here we are saying, well, you really need to contact them and tell them that you have a condition which they might have and which now might be really disruptive for their lives and for their kids. That's really hard. And I think we probably don't do enough to support people in that process, although it's actually quite hard to support. How
could you?
It's very. What we can do is we can give them.
It's like the genetic counsellor role, really.
Genetic counsellor role, we can give that individual information about their disease, which they can then pass on to others. What I do say to people is that I think it's generally a mistake to be an evangelist, where you go banging on all your relatives' doors saying, you must. It's the role of index cases to, again, provide information to the rest of the family as best they can, signpost information sources, and we can help with that, but it's up to their relatives to decide what they want to do. We can't take take on the responsibility of.
And it's up to the patient to whether they want to share it.
Yeah, and they know the dynamic in the family better than, far better than we do, of course. So, but that's another little part of that conversation about the implications of a genetic disease. There's the employment thing, there's the insurance thing.
That's why you need time.
That's why it takes an hour.
Yeah, this is why you need time. It's complex.
It takes an hour, and it may need again, that word iteration. So, ideally, elements of that conversation should be taking place more than once in the clinic. So if I send someone for a genetic test, I've already done quite a bit of the counselling beforehand.
Yeah.
But then they're going to talk to a counsellor, and there'll be some repetition, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Because, and I always say this to people, look, you're with us, you're going to be with us for a while. We're going to throw a ton of information at you, some of which you may know, some of which you don't, some of which you haven't really thought through. It doesn't matter if we don't deal with everything today. There's going to be another opportunity to do this.
Okay.
And usually the follow-up is more straightforward. But there's a long list of issues here, and I think that for me is, you do that once generally in that journey.
Yeah.
It's
important to get that right, though, isn't it?
It is.
Because that moment is what sticks in people's brains.
Yeah. Because it's not just about doing genetic testing, it's about this multifaceted approach, the fact that you're often having to counsel people about a lifelong condition as well as its implications for their family. So there are specific elements to that process.
So our next podcast in this particular diagnosis subject, we're going to look at the patient journey and look at the patient perspective and the patient experience with a patient. So it'll be really interesting to see how those two tally up. But I think it's really great to look at something from two perspectives, because I think looking at it from the clinician's perspective and the things that you think about and the things that you might struggle with or find difficult to manage or difficult to share it's really interesting to have that balance.
I think having a patient perspective is good, because I think sometimes there are things that we do actually pretty well. And getting that, we don't seek that positive feedback. Actually, what we're saying to people does help. And there are other things which we're doing which may not be so helpful. So I think cross-referencing in that way, I think is actually always useful.
Perry, fascinating as always.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And I hope we can do it again at some point.
Look forward to it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Cardiomyopathy Conversations. Please remember, any medical information contained within the podcast should not be used as a substitute for advice from your own doctors. If you have any concerns over your own condition, please do consult your medical team. Views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent the views of Cardiomyopathy UK, but are the views of the individual host or speaker and is intended for a UK audience. Cardiomyopathy UK does not accept responsibility for any actions taken after listening to this podcast.